Horror games have given us some truly terrible careers. Jobs that, under normal circumstances, no sane person would willingly accept. These games could just throw you in a haunted building and tell you to survive, but they usually don't, and there's a very good reason for that. There are entire horror games where, before anything supernatural even happens, your primary objective is basically go to your dead-end job. And this setup is everywhere. But why? Why do horror games keep making us clock in? Because one of the biggest problems in horror game design becomes much easier to solve when the player has a job. If somewhere is obviously dangerous, why wouldn't you just leave? A job solves that problem. It gives you a reason to be there and something you're supposed to be doing, and most importantly, a reason to stay somewhere that every survival instinct is telling you to abandon. Imagine walking into an abandoned building at midnight. You turn the corner, and there's someone hanging from the ceiling. Most reasonable people now have a very straightforward objective: leave, immediately. And this creates a fundamental problem for horror games. Developers need the player to voluntarily continue moving through a space that is becoming increasingly hostile. The easiest solution is physical imprisonment. Lock the door, break the car, collapse the tunnel, trap the player underground. It works, but it's conspicuous. The game's basically reaching through the screen and saying, no, you're not allowed to leave yet. Jobs offer something much more elegant. The exit can be completely unlocked. You could theoretically leave whenever you wanted, but you still have something to do. In Five Nights at Freddy's, you're not just wandering around Freddy Fazbear's Pizza because you're curious. You're the security guard. Sitting in the office is literally your job. In the closing shift, the appearance of one creepy customer doesn't immediately justify abandoning the building. There's still orders coming in, there are drinks to make, there's a status quo. You're supposed to be at work. And that tiny piece of narrative scaffolding makes the entire situation more believable. The game doesn't need to imprison you physically, it imprisons you through obligation. This also solves a quieter design problem. The player and the character do not always want the same thing. The player knows this is a horror game. The player knows going into the basement is almost certainly a terrible idea, but the character still needs a believable reason to go down there. Employment bridges that gap. You're not entering the basement because your protagonist lost all common sense. You're entering the basement because what you need to do is down there. And unfortunately, that's your problem. But a job can also provide something even more valuable than motivation: a routine. Routine is one of horror's best weapons. The first time the mortuary assistant asks you to prepare a body, the process is unfamiliar. You're learning where everything is. You're following instructions, opening cabinets, trying to remember what each tool does. Eventually though, you understand it. You grab this, do that, move here, repeat. The game conditions you into a pattern. This hallway's empty. That door stays closed. The lights make this sound. The body lies in this position. None of these details are frightening on their own, and they're not supposed to be. Their value comes from consistency. Because once the game teaches you what normal looks like, it can violate it. If a creature's standing in the corner the first time you enter a room, that's just a scary room. You had no expectation it would be anything else. But if you've walked through that room 9 times and on the 10th trip something's standing there, you notice immediately. The environment has broken one of its own rules, and people are extremely sensitive to broken patterns.
Play-Doh things are what you want. Blood sausage and a steak.
What the fuck is that?
Jobs naturally create the repetition needed for this. The coffee shop looks like this, the hallway sounds like this, the corpse is supposed to be lying like this, until suddenly it isn't. The horror doesn't need to announce itself, the game can just change one tiny variable and let your familiarity do the rest. This is where games like Closing Shift work so well. For long stretches of the game, you're simply working at a coffee shop. Take an order, make the drink, hand it over, clean something, repeat. It's intentionally boring. And because the tasks are so mundane, small abnormalities become disproportionately noticeable. Someone is staring through the window. A customer stays a little too long. Something moved. There's someone standing where nobody should be standing. The game first teaches you how its world functions, then starts contaminating that structure. You could put a giant monster in the cafe 5 minutes into the game. It would probably scare people, but you'd sacrifice the slow erosion of normality that makes the setting uncomfortable in the first place. Because that fear comes from watching something familiar become unsafe. Routine continues while the context surrounding it collapses. You're still taking orders, making drinks, cleaning tables, but the world outside that routine becomes increasingly unstable. And that creates one of my favorite kinds of horror. The game never officially tells you the normal part is over now. Instead, normality and horror begin occupying the same space. Someone may be stalking you outside. The building may no longer be safe. You may have just witnessed something completely inexplicable, but Table 4 still ordered a latte. Jobs also solve another major design problem with games. They give a reason for you to be occupied, because if your only objective in a horror game was watch for the monster, you'd probably be really good at watching for the monster. So horror games end up dividing your attention. Five Nights at Freddy's gives you cameras to watch the monsters, but it also gives you doors, lights, power, audio cues, multiple entrances. The scary part isn't simply that something's trying to reach you, it's that you can't monitor everything simultaneously. The game deliberately gives you more information than you can comfortably process. You are never supposed to feel completely caught up. Look at one camera and you're ignoring another. Check the hallway and you're not checking your power. Close the door and you're burning a finite resource. Every decision creates an information deficit somewhere else. And that's where the pressure comes from. The mortuary assistant does something similar. You're performing procedures that require concentration while the game quietly alters the environment around you, which constantly forces a decision. Do I keep working, or do I investigate what I just saw? And more importantly, can I afford to stop what I'm doing long enough to check? That's much more effective than simply placing a monster directly in front of the player, because horror thrives in the space between certainty and uncertainty. But if you see a monster constantly, eventually you understand it. But when you're distracted, you start wondering what happened while you weren't looking. And eventually the game reaches the perfect situation. You know something's wrong. You know you should be paying attention, but you have a job to do. This is probably the most important part. A good horror game forces the player to act against their own survival instincts. This is horror game design 101. You hear something in the dark. You do not want to go toward it. Unfortunately, that's where the objective is. This is why a mundane task can become terrifying. Your brain is telling you, stay here. The game is telling you, go over there. And if you want to progress, the game eventually wins. You walk into that hallway, you open the door, you descend the stairs. You can decide that absolutely nothing good is waiting down there. Eventually, though, you're the one who has to start walking. That agency makes anticipation worse. The game is not simply showing you a bad decision, it's making you participate in one. You know the risk, you understand what's probably about to happen, and you do it anyway. Good horror games exploit this constantly. They create an objective important enough that the player willingly exposes themselves to the danger. A locked door says you have no choice. An objective says you do have a choice. You just can't progress until you make the bad one. Horror games are constantly searching for believable ways to make the player endanger themselves, and a job provides almost an infinite supply. And conveniently, horror protagonists appear to have the worst scheduling luck imaginable, because these jobs are almost always happening at night. Obviously the darkness helps the horror. Reduced visibility matters. Shadows conceal information, every hallway becomes harder to read. But there's another reason the night shift works so well. Workplaces are designed to be occupied. You're standing in a space designed for hundreds of people completely alone, and that creates an uncanny kind of emptiness. Night security builds almost this entire atmosphere around this. An office tower is not inherently terrifying, but remove the employees, darken the windows, and turn off all the lights, and leave one copier running somewhere down the hall, and suddenly that same environment feels completely wrong. The workspace becomes a liminal space, not because the building itself has changed, but because you're experiencing it outside of its intended context. Game designers get enormous mileage out of this. They don't need to build an obviously haunted castle. They can take a completely ordinary environment and alter one variable, time, a supermarket after closing, a school at midnight, an office tower at 3 a.m., a restaurant after everyone's gone home. These places become frightening precisely because we already understand what they're supposed to feel like, and the game already has a perfect excuse for why you're there. Someone has to work the night shift. Congratulations, it's you. Lethal Company takes this entire concept and removes any remaining subtlety. Most horror game jobs are primarily narrative scaffolding. Lethal Company turns employment into an actual gameplay system. You have a quota, you need scrap, so you land on dangerous moons, enter facilities, and collect whatever scrap you can find and try to bring it back alive. Every survival instinct you have eventually tells you that a run has gone far enough, but you look at your quota and suddenly maybe one more trip. This is what makes the system so effective. The game barely has to force you into danger. It can just create an incentive structure and let it ruin your own life. So you become greedy, you stay longer, you split up, you go back for one final piece of scrap. This is a classic risk-reward design, except horror changes how that calculation feels. Most games reward risk with better loot. Lethal Company does that too, but the risk is knowingly walking back into a building where 3 different things have already tried to eat you. It becomes a push your luck loop instead. Leave now with your mediocre haul or gamble your safety for a better one. And because the quota converts that scrap into future survival, greed stops feeling optional. The company doesn't care whether you're comfortable, it doesn't care if you're scared, it just wants a number that keeps getting higher, which makes Lethal Company one of the purest versions of the horror game job. The monsters are dangerous, but your employer is the reason you had to meet them in the first place. Having a minimum wage job sounds boring, and that's exactly why it works in horror. A job establishes normality. It creates repetition, it divides your attention, it gives the world rules, and then it gives the designer opportunity to violate these rules. Most importantly, it gives the player believable reasons to repeatedly put themselves in danger. The task itself can be completely mundane, because once the player understands what they're supposed to be doing, The developer can start making that increasingly difficult, not by changing the job, but changing everything around it. And eventually the central question stops being, can I survive this monster? It becomes, can I survive the monster and still finish the shift? Maybe that's why horror games keep giving us jobs, because horror works best when running away isn't quite that simple. There needs to be something pulling you deeper into the situation, a reason you feel trapped, a reason to feel like you need to open that door. And games have discovered that obligation can be stronger than curiosity, stronger than common sense, sometimes even stronger than self-preservation. The monster can be standing somewhere in the dark, the lights can be flickering, half your coworkers can already be dead, but none of that changes one horrifying fact. You are still on the clock.